I remember at one point, I remember Captain Brennan calling for air support. And I couldn't distinguish everything that was being said because there was so much noise from all the firing. But I remember for the first time ever hearing him break radio procedure, and he started cussing and wanted air support, and he wanted it right now. And he didn't care about procedure, and all he wanted was air support. And it made me feel good that he was asserting his authority to the people above him. And but it also scared me that he was having trouble getting somebody to respond to him. And it finally had just gotten so intense that it was unbelievable the amount of bullets that were coming, and you just felt any second you were going to feel your brain just go blank, and or your half of your body get torn apart. And it was the most horrible, horrifying experience I've ever been in my life. For the first time in my life, I remember praying so strong. I prayed and prayed. As I crawled around out there, I remember 2 or 3 different times people would head me back the right direction, and I'd get turned around. I remember at one point I found Polino. He was hiding behind a rice dike, and he didn't have a shirt on. And I was wounded, and he said, "Hey, Don," he said, "Man, I got shot in the back. How bad is it?" And he just had a thin red line close to his backbone. And I said, "Well, you hadn't been shot." I said, "Something just kind of cut your skin." I said, "It's just a scratch." And he said, "Man, it hurts too bad to be just a scratch." And I said, "Well, it probably just clipped your bone, through your skin there, and it's a glancing shot." And as it turned out, when he got to the hospital, he had an AK-47 round laying against his spine, and or so close to his spine they didn't take it out for fear of damaging his spine, and I think it's still in there to this day. I remember at one point I was so confused and everything, and I remember crawling along, and Jim Brewer with the weapons platoon had been our FO for my platoon. And he had been shot, and we were both crawling back toward the graveyards. The antenna was sticking straight up through that rice. The rice was about 3 foot high. And we were crawling along there parallel, probably 10 yards apart. And I remember Lieutenant Wendover calling him on the radio, and of course they weren't using proper radio procedure anymore because it didn't matter. And I heard him say, "Hey, Brewer, who is that behind you?" "I don't know, sir." He said, "I'm hit. I can't turn around." And he said, "Brewer, you got to turn around." He said, "There's somebody behind you. I need to know who it is." And I remember Brewer saying, "Oh my God, it's the Gooks." And I turned around and looked, and there was about 5 of them that were about 5 meters behind Brewer and I. They were duck walking through the rice paddy, and they were following his radio antenna. And I remember Brewer saying, "Oh my God, it's the Gooks." And Lieutenant Wendover said, "Y'all get down." And they fired over the top of us, and they fired a law into that group of North Vietnamese soldiers and killed all of them. And somehow I made it back to the graveyard where I was later medevaced out. And rice paddies, they always, at a certain growing point, they're flooded with water. And those rice paddies have fish living in them. And they have all these sucker fish. They look almost like an eel. They're round and they're really pretty ugly, but they're actually fish. And as I was crawling along, this blood was just running out of my head, and a lot of it was coagulating. And I remember, I was so goofy, I just couldn't really figure out what was going on. And I remember these fish were fighting over my blood, and I remember having kind of a hallucination that these fish were getting bigger and bigger, and they were jumping out of the water, catching my blood as it was stringing down. and all of a sudden they became bigger and they started looking like alligators, and they were just going crazy over that blood. And I remember it just seemed like big alligators were jumping out of the water trying to bite my head off, and all they, you know, I realize now that they were just after the blood, and they probably wasn't more than 6 or 8 inches long at the most, these sucker fish. But I remember it just really horrified my mind to see these fish fighting over my blood. It was like they were going to eat me. At one point, right after I found Polino out there, we were laying behind this rice dike, and he had a .45 pistol in his hand, but you couldn't tell what it was. It was just a big ball of mud. And I remember it was kind of funny. He said, "Donnie, you think I ought to shoot this pistol?" And I told him, I said, "Let me get out of the way before you do, because that thing's going to blow up if you fire it." I passed out, obviously. I mean, I was unconscious. And he saw the North Vietnamese soldiers coming at him, and he played dead. And they searched his body, and they thought I was dead, so they searched my body, and they took my dog tags, and they took my letters. I had letters sealed up in a plastic bag that I carried in my fatigue pants pocket. I had maps. I had my little New Testament Bible in my chest pocket, and they took all of that stuff, and I didn't even realize it. And after I got into the hospital and spent a month there and went back to the unit, First Sergeant Rodriguez came up to me a day or two after I got back to the unit and gave me a package with all those letters and stuff in it. And he told me, here's some stuff we found in a cave about 2 miles from where y'all got hit. And so they had searched me and pulled all that stuff off my body and took it with them, and they got it to that cave where our guys found it a couple of days later. And you know, that's a pretty scary thought, knowing that I was, because they had been capturing some of our guys and tying them up and trying to drag them out of the rice paddy. And when we started getting air support in, they knew they couldn't get the prisoners out, and they shot them in the back of the head with their own .45, with our men's own .45, and executed them in the field, and left them there tied up without their boots on and all their equipment off of them. And there were a lot of enemy that came out of that village. I saw them everywhere, and they had uniforms. They weren't Viet Cong. They had uniforms. There were some Chinese cadre with them. They were blowing whistles and directing the enemy soldiers and you know, lift fire, cover fire, and all that, because as they were maneuvering around in the rice paddy, they were doing it by whistle instruction. And I started realizing subconsciously that every time a certain whistle would blow, they would lift fire, and I would move a little bit. During the time that I was crawling back to try to get back to the graveyard, I don't really know what all happened out there. From time to time, I would find somebody that was dead. I remember finding someone whose head had been pretty well chopped off by a machete, and I recognized him as one of my very good friends. That before I got married, when we were in Fort Hood, he and I double dated together, and he was a good boy. Yeah, he was from Oklahoma. It was an ugly sight. I'm not 100% sure it was him, but yet I'm sure it was him. There were other men out there that were dying. They were fighting hand-to-hand combat. The second platoon had been totally overwhelmed. Another one of my best friends, I won't say he was my best friend because he was in a different platoon, but I thought the world of him. And he was involved in hand-to-hand contact, hand-to-hand fighting, and they overwhelmed him. They wounded him, and they stabbed him over and over and over, and cut him up pretty good. His body was pretty well mutilated, and several of the other guys had been cut up like that and shot. One of our lieutenants had been tied up and shot by a North Vietnamese woman soldier, and then she was killed by our soldiers holding his pistol. and it was a tragic thing. There was some of our guys that had played dead and managed to live through it. Don Hammett and Graves, Tommy Graves, had seen an opportunity to get up and run, so we could regroup. And while they were doing that, a mortar landed between them, and it just about took off the left cheek of Don Hammett's butt, and it cut Tommy's thigh from his knee to his groin area all the way to the bone. It was a horrible wound. And I remember that when I got back to the graveyard, Martinez was there, and he had his arm propped up on his rifle, and I looked at him, and he had pieces of bone just sticking all out of his arm, and his arm was just mutilated, and I thought, that's something. If it had been me, I'd probably been freaking out. But he was just sitting there calmly, and he said, "Boy, Don, they sure effed up my arm."